Welcome everyone! For the ones of you who don't know me yet, my name is Zucconi. I'm a lecturer in artificial intelligence and a science communicator. And if this is the first time you're watching, welcome to Gamedev Graveyard. This is the weekly show where we talk about games, prototypes, postmortems, and everything that is somehow related to the world of game development. As always, tonight we have a guest, but before I introduce the guest, if you enjoyed the show, if you watched it before, if you're here the first time, then feel free to subscribe. I post a new interview actually every week. So if this is something that you might be interested, then you're more than welcome to stay. And if you want to spend 1 hour, maybe a bit longer, just talking about video games, feel free to stay. Hopefully tonight is going to be quite a relaxed chat. It's not always the case, but I think tonight is going to be like that. The only problem is that I live in London. There are 35 degrees in my bedroom right now. And with the ring light, I'm actually melting. So if you see flames behind me, it's fine. It's London. So we have that. And as always, feel free to leave a comment in the chat. I will try to address all of them. If you have a question for me or for the guest, you're more than welcome to interact with us as we go. And if there is any problem, let us know and hopefully we can fix it as we go. So with that being said, the guest that we have tonight, or today, depending what you're watching, is Tom Betts. He's a game developer and researcher, and you probably know him as a master of procedural generation. If you follow him on Twitter, you know that that's where he has spent most of his time. He's posting a lot of procedural generation stuff, and he has done a lot of very interesting talks on that subject. He's also the former lead programmer for the game studio Big Robots. And with that studio, he has published 3 games. Sir, You Are Being Hunted, The Signal From Tölva, The Lights Keep Us Safe. Those are the longest name ever, so I had to read them because I keep messing them up every time. But they're quite interesting games because, as we will see, they have a strong procedural elements to them, and hopefully Tom will help us to understand how we manage to implement that and the challenges and the benefits that such an approach has. But with that being said, let me introduce you to Tom. Hi, Tom. How are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, I'm fine. Hot, obviously, but okay.
How many degrees?
Oh, I've given up counting. I don't know.
I checked the forecast and it was saying like feels like 38, and I was like, okay,
Yeah.
totally.
It's pretty hot. I'm down here in Brighton, so it's just probably about as hot as it is in London.
I can't. I was about to cancel it tonight, but I was like, people are already watching. I have at least to try. But so please appreciate the fact that I'm absolutely melting to deliver this. So, do you want to introduce a bit yourself? What do you do? Stuff like that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a programmer, but I guess I'm also an artist and designer. As with a lot of like indie teams, I do a lot of different roles. And I come from a kind of arts background, but I've been making video games for over about 10 years now. And as you've already said, I've got a particular interest in using procedural generation to make worlds and to make kind of new innovative types of gameplay.
And it's quite interesting because you started, introducing procedural generation with all of your game basically, and even before, I remember you posting a lot of prototypes and it's small exploration games where you can go around. So the first question, maybe I think the audience might be interested in is how did you start? Where did you learn to do procedural generation?
Yeah, well, I think it probably came from a mixture of things, but in part, a lot of it is it's a cross between being lazy and being a bit of a control freak. In that, even when I was doing like artwork or music, I really didn't want to wait for other people to be able to do parts of the projects. So I didn't want to wait on someone to be able to move on with my ideas. And so I found that you could use, algorithmic approaches to kind of create content for you and create things that you individually may not be as good at making yourself. And it also just speeds up a lot of things. So I sort of just started experimenting with that in music and in art, and it gradually just kind of sort of went on from there, basically.
And while you're talking, we are watching one of your many procedural generation experiments, the Color Reef, and it's really nice. And of course, it's how many years ago have you done this? How recent is this?
That's quite recent. That's a sort of unfinished project that just came out of some other work I was doing. I did some work for installation at the Science Museum. Oh, it was the Design Museum. I lose track. Anyway, and that was based around generating plant forms. But I was just thought I'd take it a little bit further and try and make things that looked a bit more like coral based. So that's another sort of generative system that I wrote. It's not part of any of the games that I've made. It's just another thing I was like tinkering around with.
So, something you mentioned when you introduced yourself that I think was quite interesting is that you said that you're not, you didn't train, you didn't start as a programmer. You have a different sort of background. So the thing is, how if someone wants to start with procedural generation, where should they start? Where can they learn it? Is there a school for procedural generation? What is the journey for that?
Um, well, to me, it's connected to a lot of similar strands through different types of art. So it's procedural generation. Sometimes you can kind of exchange it with ideas of randomness and chance, and there's lots of artwork and music that's based around randomness and chance. And you can do a lot of interesting things with very simple like mechanisms. I think that a lot of the stuff I do is actually very simple. It's just I spend a lot of time on it, like layering it up. And I think that sometimes people are put off because they have a look at it and there's just a massive amount of technical detail and there's a lot of like very overload of information. And I was approaching it from the point of view is I wanted to make something that I liked the look of. I wasn't bothered about which particular mathematical technique I was using or how solid the code was or anything like that. So I think really to start working on something like that, you should find something that you really like the look of, and then find out how that is done, and maybe see if you can, take some lessons from that. And that could be in anything. That could be a AAA game. It could be a piece of music. It could be a piece of web art. It could be anything really.
And what I think is interesting about proc gen in general is that often it leads to very organic shapes because plants or animals are pretty much procedural generated, if you want, especially plants, they can sort of change the shape, but the rules are more or less the same. But you're not necessarily constrained by making something that looks exactly like a specific tree. If you use it
Yeah.
for a game, it can look it looks very alien, but there are
Yeah.
entire games like I'm thinking No Man's Sky, for example, that base their entire aesthetics on these alien, weird-looking plants. So I think that even when procedural generation fails, it can be quite interesting in the
Yeah.
things that it
I
proceed.
mean, I don't think. I mean, that's the interesting thing about it. Is that the other reason I enjoy working with it is you're working with it's like working with a kind of unpredictable co-artist. So you write the code, but you don't always know what it's going to make, and sometimes it makes things that you just couldn't predict, and sometimes they're great. So I'm not even like you say the fail cases aren't always failures as such. They can generate something that you can then go, oh, I'm going to go down that avenue now because I like the way that looks. And I think that's really important. It's a really interesting part of procedural generation. It's not a way to. I did a talk ages ago about how you can use procedural generation not to solve problems. To me, it's not about solving problems. It's about exploring spaces, whether that's within gameplay mechanics or whether it's in visual aesthetics or anything really. And when you're exploring somewhere, you've got to be a little bit more open about what it is that you're getting back from that system.
I think this is quite nice also because like it's not always easy to control it in a way, but something that for me is quite fascinating is the fact that usually when you make traditional traditional art, you're pretty much in control of every aspect of it, or at least every aspect is intentional. For example, if you're a painter, something I say all the time is that if you're a painter, every stroke is intentional. Then you might not be necessarily aware of the results, but you do it intentionally. You intentionally having that stroke. You intentionally, hitting, sculpting in a certain way. So there is always your input, and you know that your input has been there. With procedural generation, I think it's the kind of art where, okay, you write the code with intention, but when you run it, you can be surprised by your own creation in a way that maybe you cannot in a painting or you cannot in a sculpture, because yes, you can say, oh my god, this, it was really well executed. But I think that proc gen can lead to the next step, which is like you don't know what it's going to create sometimes, and maybe this is the beauty, that you have to discover it as well. And it's something that I don't know if you can have that level of discovery in traditional art.
I mean, it's interesting. Like, a lot of the things that inspired me were from art. So there's a movement called Fluxus, which is all based around games and playing games. And one of the famous pieces of that is a instructional piece of work. And if you look at artists like Sol LeWitt and Claude Lemont-Young, they did a lot of instructional-based artworks, and one of them is draw a line and follow it, and that's the instruction. And that's like one of the classic examples. And there's just so much you can do in those sort of situations. And Sol LeWitt he gave people instructions on how to do his work. So one good one is like you just get a pen and then you draw a line freehand at the top of a wall, and then someone else has to follow your line underneath, and then that repeats until the wall's full. But because you can never do a perfectly accurate straight line, by the time it gets to the bottom of the wall, the pattern's just completely procedural. It's just totally, based on other people's inconsistencies when they're drawing, and those are all kind of adding up. So there are examples of doing that within traditional art, but not like you say in a kind of case where you're trying to do a photographic painting. These are people who've deliberately built in that kind of generative aspect into their work, even before we could do that on computers.
That's quite interesting. So just something that I know there's a lot of sort of discussion about, especially sometimes the students are always, oh my god, what term do I use? Do you have any difference between like random, procedural, generative? Do you use them interchangeably, or do you give them a slight variation? Because I've seen many people giving their own explanation, but sometimes they differ depending on which books you're reading, which blogs you're reading, which website you're reading. I have my own version, but I'm curious to see what is yours, or if you have one.
I mean, I put random. I wouldn't ever call the things I do random. Randomness is like a resource, a random number generator. It creates random numbers, but there's so many random number generators, and each one of them has a kind of flavor. So they're kind of like colors, eventually. I mean, in fact, in music, different types of noise, which is basically randomness, is given different colors names. So you've got brown noise and pink noise and white noise, and they all have different kind of like qualities to them. So when you use randomness in like procedural generation, that's a very kind of primal part of the system. But you can use randomness just to roll a die. That doesn't make it a procedural generation function. You're just rolling a die. It's to me, it's about how you combine all those systems, and you kind of curate the sort of outputs that they can make. So like I sometimes use procedural generation and generative similarly, although procedural generation generally is a term that's connected with video games, whereas generative is much more connected with like generative music or generative art. Not really sure what the basis is in that, but a lot of the same systems exist between the two, but I personally wouldn't include randomness. Randomness is a tool to create generative work or procedural generation, but I wouldn't really call it random. You see what I mean?
No, that makes sense. Usually the sort of quick definition that I tend to tell to my students is like procedural is randomness with constraints. is a chosen randomness. Is like random is more the inputs you put is the seed that starts it, and
Mhm.
based on that you can build upon. But yeah, I think more or less
In
we
fact, I think that the worst examples of procedural generation and generative are when there is very little done with the randomness. There was I was chatting to a friend of mine at one point. We reckoned we could kind of smell Perlin noise. If you could look at a game or a piece of work and you'd be like, okay, I can see it straight away. I can see it in there because they've just taken that noise function and they haven't actually done anything else with it. So it's just there like a brush stroke, and you can see the brush that's been used. And I think you want to go a bit further than that, basically.
it's a bit like when they say your game looks like it's made in Unity. The
Yeah,
sort of like like borderline insult. It's
yeah, a
like
little bit.
I can see it's Perlin noise, is it?
Yeah, a little bit.
So yeah, there is it. But speaking of Perlin noise and procedural generation in games, basically all the three games I mentioned before, they all heavily feature procedural generation on many different levels. The first one, big release you did with big robots is Sir, You Are Being Hunted. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I haven't been making games at all, and I've just been making kind of art, I guess, basically. And I got the opportunity to make a game for Channel 4 back, it must be over 10 years ago now, with a bunch of friends. And then we managed off the back of that. We thought, well, we managed to do that. None of us had made a game before at that point, and we all kind of pitched in and learned I think it was Unity, the first version of Unity or Unity 2 at the time. And then from that, we thought, well, if we can do this, maybe we should just try and make one of our own. So that's how Surf started. And it was an idea that James Carey and Jim Rossignol really came up with, which was the background and the setting. And that kind of melded into my interest in generating organic spaces, and also a kind of revelation that if you look at an aerial photo of the UK of traditional British countryside, it looks like a Voronoi diagram. It looks like a mathematical structure. And I was like, yes, we could use that. I can make this. So that's kind of that's the impetus for it anyway.
So right now we are watching a video of Syria being hunted, being played. So what? How did you harness this? We can say so. Procedural generation. What aspects of the game are procedural?
Oh, well, I mean, almost everything really. There are one, two, three, four, five islands. No, four islands.
Four islands.
Four islands in the game. Yeah, and each one is generated from scratch, and then every item on those islands is placed algorithmically. All the loot, all the objects in the scenery, all the terrain textures are applied algorithmically, and then the enemies are also placed algorithmically, and they're given patrol routes and behaviors and so on. So it's the procedural generation didn't go as far into like it doesn't generate in that game. It doesn't generate meshes. It doesn't generate that many textures aside from the terrain ones. It manipulates like a big library of assets to create these islands. So that's kind of how it works.
So we're watching now one of your videos where basically you show how the different steps to generate
Right.
the islands, and I can see that as you said, when you look from afar, you can literally see the Voronoi diagram that basically is based on is based to generate the
Hmm.
entire thing. Now something that for me it's quite interesting, and probably if people keep watching the video will see, is that all the four islands, they've been generated in a very similar ways, but it seems that, I mean, the steps seems very similar, but what
Mm.
seems to me different is the parameters that you
Yeah.
are using. How does it work?
Um, well, in Sir, it uses it starts off with a uniform kind of Voronoi grid, and then it shuffles it around a bit so that it becomes more uneven, and then it can also kind of scale and size the different cells of that. But then it goes through, and I think one of the most important things about making good procedural generation work in games is you need to give the world that you're generating a sense of purpose. Like if you go around anywhere, you everything in the real world has a sense of purpose. Like a valley is created because a river has flowed from A to B. There's a gap between the mountains because people have built a road from B to C. And I think without those sort of senses of intent in a generated world, it can often feel really samey, and it can feel like it's just been churned out of a machine. So in Sir, I would pick specific locations that would then be, each of those cells would then be flagged as a village, and then I would draw paths between those villages, introducing new cells to create roads, and then I would line the roads with fields and houses that only existed sort of relative to those. And then I would also go around the island and find out where it met the sea and turn those cells into beaches. And then there'd be certain things like little rowing boats that only appeared on beaches. And then you'd get like forests that occurred, but they'd be further away from the roads. So it was all about just sort of slowly building up a sort of series of logical steps based on what each cell could be. So each of those Voronoi cells is a specific type of, I guess, miniature biome, whether it's a copse of trees or a little hill or a village or a road or a field. And then after those have been assembled, they have like a set of rules so they can kind of exclude each other. So you can't have like a lake in the middle of a village, and you can't have a village on the top of a massive hill. And then once that's all been kind of taken care of, so then goes into each individual cell, and then it decorates that cell procedurally as well. So there's like a two-step process where you make all the regions, and then it goes back through the regions. And you can see it in the videos actually. It goes back through the regions, and it's like, okay, this is a forest. I'm going to scatter trees in this forest, and I'm going to do it with this particular type of technique. Or if it's a field, it's going to put hedgerows and walls around the outskirts of it, leave a little gap, and then fill the middle with crops. So that kind of system really.
So I think the biggest problem for me when we're doing procedural generation full levels that people have to replace, that in a way you are generating endless, if you want, levels that people can play, so that's good. But if you're not careful, the risk is that those levels ended up being all the same. And I feel that some games really hit that hard. No Man's Sky, I was mentioning before, at least, in its original release, many players weren't happy because everything looked the same, beautifully the same, but it looked very similar. And it's something that you could almost see from the trailer. That is like, okay, those planets, they're all the same, right? It's 1.8 quintillion, but they're all the same, right? So how do you balance sort of the novelty aspect of having to create something that feels fresh with a typicality, so it has to look as if it's the same biome, but it doesn't have to be repetitive? How do you keep the player engaged with that?
Yeah, I think it's actually weirdly, I think it relates to the way that good games base their economies on notions of rarities. So if you have a situation where you just have like the same distribution across your entire game space, that's when it gets dull. Like I agree with you about No Man's Sky, and weirdly enough, No Man's Sky is like the planets are like the biomes in Minecraft. And when you play Minecraft, you're in a biome, but you can always see another one, and you can get to it. In No Man's Sky, you can't see the next planet. You don't know what it's like, and I think that that's a big difference, because the planet you're on in No Man's Sky. If you walk all the way around it, it's going to be the same type of thing the whole way around. Whereas in Minecraft, you can see something in the distance, and when you get there, it's probably going to be different, at least until you played it a lot. And I think that it's to do with that distribution of difference across the area, and you can't just do it in a really even random way. Like the way that Minecraft does it is using the Whittaker diagrams. Do you know those? They're like a kind of a very naturalistic spread of where you assign particular areas, but it's not linear. It's not like there's two of those, two of those, two of those. It's like there's loads of these, and then there's a few of those, and then there's like these, but only next to these. And I think the more you can build in those rules, and the more you can make your space. Again, it's a little bit like compositionally looking at painting. If the painting's all the same color, it's not as interesting, or at least it doesn't move your eye around it. Whereas if you have different proportions of things, and in a game, in a way you'd make the economy work, you'd have like the smaller areas would be the rarer ones, which would have the greater rewards because there's less of them around. So there's more incentive to hunt those out. Whereas the larger areas have the more common items in them. So I think if you can think about it in just a way of like a distribution sort of set. I don't know what the mathematical term is because I don't really know, but you probably know what it is. But I think that makes quite a bit of difference if you want to make something not feel like super samey.
So we have already a few messages in the chat. So let me see. Hi Tim. Hi Solomon. So we have a question from Tim asking, question for Tom. Procedural level generation has been critiqued for contributing to generic layouts and an uneven content set, which is basically what we were mentioning now. What do you see as the challenges of narrative and play focus within randomly generated levels?
I think you should probably integrate the narrative and the mechanics with the level generation. That just doesn't happen in a lot of those cases that you're talking about where it doesn't work. It's because that aspect of the gameplay hasn't been included. So it's almost like someone has been given, the job, go and make a world, and someone else is given the job, go and make the narrative. And unless those two are kind of integrated, it's just not going to work. There's no reason for them not to work well together. For instance, if you're generating like a landscape and you make a lighthouse, and then the system puts I don't know, someone's old musket in the lighthouse. There's no reason why the system, because it knows that's in the lighthouse, can't write a note and leave it on the desk in a cottage somewhere else on the island that says, oh, I left my musket in the lighthouse. And there's lots and lots of really interesting stuff you can do with those systems. It's just that not many people have been exploring that, and often the teams, this is a problem with game design in general, and why game design often falls into very traditional tropes, is because particularly the bigger you get, the less teams challenge each other's work and work across disciplines. And I think that you can actually fix most of these problems. You just have to kind of think about the discipline that's the issue, say narrative, think about in procedural terms, what can you do? And then actually integrate that with the design of the system that's making the world, that's also involved in making the narrative. Failbetter do a really good job with this kind of stuff. And Emily Short is amazing. All her work's really interesting. She's written some great, documents on this, and her talk's fantastic. So there's lots of resources out there. It's just, I guess, people need to kind of grab the bull by the horns and try and fix it.
And I can see a lot of issues when you're trying to generate, for example, procedural stuff. I'm thinking about a dungeon. It's very easy to make a procedural dungeon. You can use a labyrinth, you can use a maze, a lot of libraries, so it's fairly common. But then when you start integrating that into the player experience, it's like, okay, to open this door, I need to get this key. To kill this boss, I need to get those upgrades. And this creates a sort of constraint on how you need to generate the level, because it's not just a space problem. It's not just, let's explore a space. It's, in order to do these, I have to do these first.
Yeah, but that's only because you're designing very traditional games with very set in stone rule sets, because the green key opens the green door, which is fine and it works in a lot of games, but it's quite an old idea. And instead of perhaps trying to fix old ideas to fit into this new way, maybe just don't do that. Maybe try and do something else. Unexplored does a really good job of this, actually. The key lock type of setup, and you can do it, you can fix it, but I'm not sure the key lock is a big thing that we need to worry about losing. It's not the best mechanic in the world. It's fine, but I kind of appreciate more alternative. I really like Spelunky's approach to a lot of this, where it says, I'm not going to like restrict this to being the one solution to one problem. I'm basically going to give you the tool set so that you can get out of this situation. So, it's like, oh, I remember reading Derek Hughes' book, which is great. It's like Spelunky little boss fight book. I don't know if you read it. It's really good. It's got like a big overview on the front. Anyway, and he was saying he was trying to work out how he would like, I guess it's quite an academic approach, like do a search tree to work out if the levels were solvable. And he was getting really hard. It's like, well, maybe you can't get to the exit. There's a wall in the way. And he was like, yeah, this is really. I'm just going to give you bombs. You can blow a hole in the wall. And I'm like, yes, that's the kind of solutions I'm after. Like, to me, that's fine. I've got no problem with that. It's a great game. It doesn't suffer from the fact that it's got these like solutions in there. So I don't know really. I think a lot of those. Sometimes you get solutions in game design that are all problems and solutions. They're almost there as kind of exercises because they're part of the kind of canon rather than things that necessarily need to be used anyway.
I was about to mention Spelunky exactly for that, for the very quote, basically, because I think it really represents the what game development is about. And I have, for example, a lot of students that they have a vision and they want to get that vision 100% in the game, and I'm like, this is not working. This is not working. You can make it. It's not fun. It's not, not the games have to be about fun, but it's not enjoyable to play. It's not interesting. I don't like it. Maybe do this prototype and see what people like about this prototype, do a lot of playtesting, and make that the key of the game. And sometimes this works better than trying to force a mechanic, a vision that might not necessarily happen unless you're very skilled in realizing that. And I think that Procedural Generation has, in a sense, that aspect where if you try to force it to be exactly what you want, it's unlikely it's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you probably shouldn't be using it in that case. Just make it by hand if you want it to be exactly a particular way.
So you also mentioned before the fact that I think you said something like, oh, Procedural Generation has no purpose or something like that. Has no intention, maybe you said something like that. And I find
randomness has no intention.
Yeah, sorry, randomness has no. And I find it quite interesting because I've seen a lot of people that step number one, you're doing a procedural level, a procedural map, for example, like the one in Serial Being Hunted, procedural island, procedural terrain, and you let just the procedural elements taking place. But it would be very hard to make this look real because those are the processes you simulated are not the ones that really give rise to mountains and lakes and stuff. And I've seen a lot of devs working on creating this map first, and then running a pass, simulating, for example, water erosion and sediment deposition. So it's like, okay, the map is average, it's mediocre, and it's very pearly noisy. It's very Voronoi. But now let's simulate water and let's see where lakes are going to form, and let's see how sediment is going to form. And there are a lot of approaches to do that. If you have a chance, for the people watching, if you have a chance, have a look at Red Blob Games.
Yes.
Yeah.
This stuff's great.
Yeah, the blog is amazing. And there is a tool, maybe it's about Procedural Generation for the rains. I don't remember the name, but I tweeted about it a few days ago because every time I find it again, I'm amazed. Where you can generate a procedural terrain, which is mostly random, and then you can simulate the precipitation level and how dry the terrain is and how hard or soft the terrain is, and this really creates much more natural looking, almost you go from Voronoi to almost fractal patterns, which is what a lot of mountains look like if you zoom them out. And I feel it's a beautiful. And if I'm not wrong, it's the one that Dwarf Fortress is actually using. I think they're actually simulating a bit of civilization, a bit of a time going
Yeah.
on when they create something. And I think
Mm.
that if you do it properly, it can really enhance your world, because suddenly it gives a meaning, gives a purpose, it gives a history to stuff, and you can say you can get features that it would very hard to have otherwise. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I can see the river has changed its path, and if you had to do that manually, oh my god,
Mm.
that would be a mess. But maybe if you can simulate a
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah. Mm.
or even have ancient ruins and try to see where people will go, where walk, and having pathfinding on that and try to generate that. I think that would be amazing, But
Mm.
I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going crazy. I'm talking about too much procedural generation.
No, I know. I think no, you're right. I would argue that sometimes you can just do the exact reverse, particularly if you don't. I mean, the way you're talking about it is like very, very kind of researchy and kind of quite like there are people who just write software to simulate these kind of effects, and they're not doing it for games. They're just doing it for I don't know geographical, insight and so on. So you can do that. Sometimes you can just do the opposite way around, especially if you're making a game and the person's not going to sit there waiting for your crazy erosion algorithm to calculate how much sediment moves down a hill. You might just want to go, well, we need a river for this to work as a game mechanically because we need a barrier between this point and this point. So I'm going to put a river in before I even generate the world around it. So it's almost like you put in the things you require first and then generate the world around those things. Because there's approaches where you can basically make an island and then you put a river in and that doesn't satisfy what you need from the gameplay. So at that point you have to evaluate that and generate the island again and keep doing that until you get the thing you need. And that's just not feasible at runtime for a lot of cases. So in that situation, I'd be like, well, just don't do that. It's not like the majority of games that we play are actually set in anywhere realistic anyway. like you play like Skyrim or any kind of game with a fantastical landscape in, and the landscape has been designed in a completely unrealistic way, and players don't complain. They don't sit there going, well, that particular mountain wouldn't have been formed, at this point in the landscape. They're too busy having fun running around. So I don't think that it's actually required in most games for you to make something that is realistic. You've got to make something that suits the purpose of the game
It's
and is
believable, but
interesting and fun, yeah, and believable to explore. So I think you can cut a lot of corners, you can cheat a lot, and I think that's worth doing over doing like crazy high-end simulations of stuff if you get the same results.
Hadi D from the chat mentions, yeah, I've seen Sebastian Lake doing water erosion on terrain. Yes, I've seen his video tutorial thing. It's amazing.
Right.
It's really, really good. And a shout out to Sebastian. If you don't know him,
Yeah, he does some good videos.
I'm sure if you're on YouTube, you probably know him. Sebastian has a lot of very good resources, and you can definitely see the amount of passion he puts in all of his projects. So it's really good. I've met him only once, but he was a really nice chap. So hopefully, when this is over, I can start meeting cool people from the game industry again. But yeah, if you don't know him, really good stuff. So you were talking about cheating and sometimes try to force the thing you need first before running the procedural generation thing. So do you have like cheats or tricks or hacks, I don't know, that you've seen done with procedural generation to make it work better, or things that people are doing, the developers are doing?
For a while.
Sorry, say it again. I think I lost you for a
Oh,
second.
sorry, I jumped in.
I think.
Oh, okay. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can. I think I've lost you for like
Okay.
3 seconds.
Oh, okay. I think at the minute, the thing I use a lot, which I'm really interested in at the minute, is using pathfinding as a really key part of procedural generation, because pathfinding is kind of got that intent. It's how do you get from this point to this point in the most effective way. And that holds true for, rivers, it holds true for roads and paths and all kinds of other, like either natural or like human driven phenomena and features. And so I find myself using it a lot now. And so it's really quite simple as well to use it as a tool for that. Rather, most people think of pathfinding as a real-time thing that happens where your enemy units are wandering around. Whereas if you could take say for instance, if I take like a grid or a Voronoi cell, and then I randomly seed or deliberately seed each of those cells in the grid with a value that's how difficult it is to move through that space. And then I could pick two locations, location A and B in that world, and then it will calculate the pathfinding, just as A star pathfinding system can calculate a path between those two, and you'll automatically get a path that you know is complete, and B, a path that has interesting properties in that it's avoiding areas that are difficult to move through. So you can make those areas into swamps, you could make them into water, you could make them into cliffs or forests. It doesn't really matter what you make them, but you've got that intent that's sort of built in that system. And it also removes a lot of the problems you can get if you do it the other way around, where if you generate a system, then try and see if you can get from point A to point B, and then throw away the generation if you can't do that. Which again, you might end up having to do that hundreds of times until you find something that's appropriate. So I tend now to do the opposite way around. I guarantee my paths, and then I generate the world around them.
I think this is something I absolutely love about procedural generation. So you mentioned pathfinding. Now, if you have studied it, if you have implemented it, you know that there are a lot of algorithms, but more or less they're always the same, right? You have tiny changes, but more or less it's A star, variants of Dijkstra, more or less it's them. You get them all the time. But when it comes to procedural generation, if you ask a developer what techniques are you using, every developer is likely to give you a complete different solution. And
Yeah,
this is
maybe.
amazing. This is amazing. I have one class in which I'm showing a sort of overview of techniques, and I'm like, those are like 10 I found from those 10 games, but any game that has procedural stuff probably is a different one. And it's really fascinating how so many people have been able to come up with so many different ideas, different solutions, different approaches to generate the content that they needed.
Hmm.
And there isn't, there are of course techniques and strategies and tools, but they tend to be more at a low level. Like, how do I generate a Voronoi pattern? How do I make Pearly noise? How do I make Gaussian distributed numbers? How do I make, Poisson disk sampling? All the kind of techniques. But then this is very low level. How you use it to make the content that you want to make,
Hmm.
that's a mystery. That's almost an art. That's not the part that you teach. That's almost magic. is that your is that your is that your experience as well?
Um, I think, I mean, I guess a lot of those techniques and the way you combine them together, they have their own sort of aesthetic. They have their own kind of style that they will imprint on whatever you're doing. So, if you make something that's a grid-based dungeon crawler, it's going to have that feel, or that feel's going to be in there somewhere. If you make a Voronoi diagram, that's going to have that feeling. If you use just overlapping noise like octaves, that's got a feeling. And I think that people, when they're making games, they look for what it is that they need to put into that project. So if they want it to feel one way or the other, then they'll use a particular technique and they'll blend it that way. I guess it does seem a little bit more wide-ranging than something like AI, whereas you can use like behavior trees or finite state machines or planners or whatever. But even within those, if you were to look at the way people actually implement those systems, there's some crazy variations in there. People do all kinds of stuff with them that you wouldn't expect. So perhaps it's just that there's not as much of a history, or there's not as much procedural generation that's happened yet for those kind of to come to be known. I don't know.
I'm thinking maybe might also be the fact that it's not taught traditionally.
Right. Mm.
So for AI, for example, you see a lot of people using, as you said, behavior trees and state machines and stuff. But that is also because the very established tools that they get usually, if you do an AI for games class, you teach them. Then how people use
Yeah.
them, it's up to them. But usually you get them in almost any basic game AI module or course. But when it comes to ProcGen, I have not seen I've not seen the same sort of established patterns.
No, there probably isn't. I mean, I think actually quite a few proc gen stuff is nowadays coming into like shader work, because there's a lot of the same kind of functions can be used in that kind of end of game design as well. So people are learning about, these kind of noise algorithms and how to combine all these various systems, and they're doing it in shaders.
And I find it very interesting the fact that in shaders you technically don't have a random function, but
Yeah.
well, I mean, whatever that means. But you have, if you go on Shader Toy and you search for noise function, you find trillions of ways to come up with very weird
Yeah.
trigonometrical functions that generate seemingly
Yeah.
random numbers, or different distributions
Yeah.
that you can use. And I
Yeah.
find it quite.
I think it also,
Yeah, go on, go on.
yeah, it also comes from the demo scene, which I was really into. The demo scene is the place where procedural generation really took off in a lot of ways, and has been like part of it since the 80s. And a lot of the algorithms that people use today were pioneered back then on like the Atari ST or the Amiga or whatever. We're still using some of the same stuff. It's just at a greater level of kind of complexity now.
But I think that for many of those games, the procedural elements was a necessity because they weren't necessarily looking to create more content. They were looking to put the content on a floppy disk or compress
Yeah.
it in a way that you couldn't store maybe 1,000 levels. So the only way to do
Hmm.
it was to generate them through code. So I think that
Yeah.
nowadays the reason why to use procedural generation techniques has shifted from something like Elite, in which you needed that to get all the amount of content,
Yeah. Yeah.
to something like today, where it's more used to create certain elements, to create a more rich environment that
Hmm.
doesn't need to have 3 million hours of developers' time or artist time to create every single plant and tree and thing and
Yeah.
placement.
Yeah.
And and I think that this leads me to another question that I often think about. So, procedural generation has been around probably since the very first games. Maybe not Pong, but almost there.
Hmm.
And I'm thinking, Rogue, very influential game. I loved it. I played so much. The Italian version, it was terrible. It was terrible, but it was so poorly translated. But and it was called Magic Labyrinth, so it didn't even have an Italian
Right.
name. So, but beside that, and the procedural generation there was very simple, but almost every aspect of the game was procedural, including the name of the scrolls, the spells.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what do you think? How do you think have the expectations of players changed? So, from in respect to procedural generation, what are the expectation from something like Rogue compared to something like Diablo, which is, in a guess, this sort of spiritual successor,
Mm.
I think, of the original Rogue in a way. So what do you think people expect nowadays from a procedural generation system?
I think to be honest, most people associate those systems with particular types of games like Diablo, like you're saying. The fact that there's a roguelike genre now, roguelike basically most people's heads is what they think procedural generation is in a lot of cases. And so they measure those games against that kind of heritage. So they're like, is it as good as Diablo? Does it create stuff that's interesting for me to run around and smash up, and is the loot distribution good and not like totally imbalanced, and can I replay it and grind through these levels without it getting boring? And I think that those games are judged on the basis of the best examples of those roguelikes. When it's used in a slightly different context, say No Man's Sky, people have a different approach to it, because in that case, that it was how it was marketed, as like it was creating a world. It wasn't there to create like a loot fest grind cycle. It was there to create a space. And similarly, it does a similar thing in Minecraft. So there's different types of procedural generation in games, and I think that the audience is kind of smart enough to distinguish between those, and then they are now having different expectations based on which branch of procedural generation they think that they are buying into when they play a game.
It's quite interesting, and something where I have very mixed feelings about. You mentioned Minecraft a lot, we mentioned No Man's Sky. So you have this power to generate seemingly infinite, virtually infinite content. But is it that important? For example, No Man's Sky, 1.8 quintillion planets. More planets than stars in the Milky Way. So nobody is going to experience that amount of content. So why is that becoming something that you want to mention on a trailer? Minecraft doesn't do that, but for example, if you don't know it, a map in Minecraft, it's around, I think it's the diameter is something like one of the sides is 60 million meters or something like that. So it's like larger than the surface of this planet. And you're at the point where nobody's ever going to experience that amount of content. So do we need it? Why can't we make a smaller maps? And
You can, yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons for it. One is the tedious kind of like push of games marketing to insist that more content is better, and therefore you should spend more money. Game A is better than game B because it has, this much more content. That's one reason. And the other reason is that, and I think the second reason is less important now, since the impact of it is lessened because it's been used so many times, is the kind of psychological impact of saying this is infinity. That kind of adds something psychically to the presentation of something. If you say this is infinite, regardless of not whether you visit any of it or none of it, it still makes that space in your head feel a little bit different, because it's got that kind of almost philosophical question, like this is an infinite space. The other thing as well, of course, is that nowadays there's so many people playing games that you individually may only ever visit a tiny portion of this space, but in total, the entire number of people who play those games, they might visit quite a bit of it because there's so many of them. And if you're designing a game as a developer, maybe that's important for you. Maybe you want to say, well, all these people are getting their own bit of this space, and by making it practically infinite, we are giving everybody the chance to have their own part of this space. And that in itself is also a kind of interesting proposition.
that's nice. So I've been watching a video a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, where this guy has been playing Minecraft for something like 8 years on an old map, always going in the same direction. And after the 8 years, he reached, I think he was the first person to reach without any cheating and teleportation of any kind, one of those weird structures that you used to get in Minecraft when the generation was getting at the floating point precision limit. That is not even remotely the end of the map, but it's getting close to the point where the algorithm fails because of rounding errors. And it was honestly almost emotional seeing this guy crying because he has reached that. I don't know if you watched that.
No, but I made a little racing game, which is on my itch page somewhere, which is like an infinite racing game where the landscape's just a voxel landscape that you drive through, and it goes through different types of biomes. They're all different algorithms, and it merges them together. And it's sort of unfinished. It was part of my research when I was doing my PhD, but I'd never seen anyone play it for more than how long I'd expected. And then I found a video once where someone had done exactly that. They played it and they'd found a little glitch in it which allowed them basically not to die. And so they could just keep playing it. And so they played it until it reached that point where the floating point arrows were kicking in. And then the landscape just starts to deconstruct as they're flying through it. And it was great. I was really happy. I was like, whoa, yeah, I've never seen this.
Oh my
So
god,
there's a kind of,
this is really
yeah,
nice. This is really nice.
there's a sort of mythology about it. In Minecraft, they were called the Farlands to begin with, I think.
Yeah,
You know,
but I think they've been
I think,
fixed now, so I don't think that in the
yeah, I think they did
latest
fix it. Yeah.
versions you can get them. But yeah, it's kind of interesting that someone wants to get that as a challenge. I
Mm,
lot of people would say, "Oh my god, you wasted 8 years of your time," but I think
yeah.
that the level of commitment
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fine. It's good.
It's something that you will achieve if you just keep doing it. It's not like, oh, in 8 years I can cure
Yeah.
cancer. It's like in 8 years I can reach the first part of the Firelands. Good.
Yeah.
So I know. Again, I don't want to say it's a big achievement in general, but I would say it's a lot of commitment, and you have to be very, very committed to play the same versions of Minecraft for 8 years
Yeah. Yeah. You
just to
certainly do.
get that. So I don't remember the name of the guy. Hopefully, if I can find the video again, I will try to put it somewhere. I think it was quite nice, and I watched it at the time when I just started playing Minecraft, so I wasn't really aware of the importance of that. So
Right.
rewatching it later, I was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing!" But beside that, that's me going off a tangent. So you've been working, as we were saying at the beginning, on a few other games that are on Steam, and one it's called the Signal from Tölva, which I hope I've pronounced correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's about right. I think. I mean, that game, that was our second big robot game, I think, if we don't count the Channel 4 thing. But the game doesn't feature procedural generation in the run time. It was basically the world is a static world when you play that game. And there's two campaigns, there's two worlds effectively, and both of those worlds were generated using procedural tools that I wrote. But once the game was done, those were fixed, so that the environment, the landscape, was generated procedurally and then hand edited. So the game isn't quite as PCG as the other ones I worked on, for instance.
And I find this very, very interesting because it's clearly a different approach, and it's one that leads probably to it makes it, I wouldn't say easier, but maybe makes more manageable to design a narrative elements around it, because now you have full control over
Hmm.
how you want to design
Yeah,
the missions and the map in a way that otherwise you couldn't. And you also give all players the same stuff. So
yeah,
what
yeah,
was
exactly.
the rationale behind his choice?
I think it was just that kind of thing where you often do when you work on a project for a couple of years and you finish it. You often want to do something that's a bit different. That's like not, you don't want to do something that's completely different because you don't know if you'll be able to achieve that. But taking what you've done, but like taking it down a slightly different path, it would have been it would be very hard for us to have done another game just like Sir at that point because we were all pretty much like tired of it at that point. As with any long project, you get a bit tired of it. So we didn't have the resources or the money to build a big team that could do the world generation for us. So we took the tech that I developed to generate a world which was then hand edited. So the hand editing process took Jim like a year plus at least. Probably, I think it was longer than that actually, especially if you take both maps into account. Um, and that was something that we knew we could do, but we couldn't generate the entire world as well as that. So that's why we turned to the procedural techniques. because we're a small studio. We knew that we could do this, so we used it to basically kickstart the environment, really.
We are looking now at the map from the Signal from Tölva, and I can sort of see that there are Voronoi cells, but
Yeah,
in a way that they're in disguise.
yeah. I mean, the algorithm was based on that, but they got quite quickly kind of like blurred and clad, and there are little tunnels through spaces and so on. So yeah, it doesn't feel like it at all when you play the game. You can't tell, because you're not in that perspective. Obviously, you're on the ground, but the spaces themselves don't feel like they're cell based.
And I think it works in giving a more organic, a more like natural landscape in a way.
Yeah,
And I think it works
yeah,
really,
yeah.
really well. And I've seen in a lot of, I haven't played a game. I'm not, I can't play first person shooter. I'm too bad at that. but I've played Sir, You Have Been Hunted, and I was terrible at it. So I was like, okay, enough for me, enough. But it's true. You don't feel the kind of it doesn't look like it's procedural in that sense, in a good way. It looks like it's
Yeah,
very it's crafted by hand almost.
yeah.
So I think that
Well, I mean, yeah. In Sir, it was all procedural. In Tolva, most of it was kind of handcrafted in a weird way. Um, but yeah, I think if you're going to make a procedurally generated game, you should try not to make it look procedurally generated in most cases. I think.
the question then is, if it is procedural and you committed to one, how many did you generate? Did you have like
Yeah.
did you have like a selection of like 20? It was like, we can use this one, or we can use this one, or we can use
Yeah, well,
how did it
I
go?
did. I did the same as I've kind of talked about before, in that I basically gave Jim a painting tool so he could paint in really roughly a rough idea of how he wanted the lowlands and uplands of the place to be, and then my tool took his like rough sketch and modelled the world around it. So rather than just keep making them until the one was right, he was like, I kind of want there to be a way around the west here, and then a bit here that's open, and he just did it in like almost in MS Paint. It was very crude, and then that was what we used as the basis to generate the world around. So it kind of goes back to what I've been saying before about like pre-planning elements of it.
And I think it worked amazingly well. So in terms of marketing, how did how did you tell people that it was procedural, but it was offline procedural?
No, we didn't. We didn't even talk about it really. I mean, I did a little blog write-up about how we made the landscape, but it wasn't important in that project really. It was just a back-end tool for us in the studio. It wasn't something that's impacted on the game once we'd used it and gone beyond that point. I mean, after about I don't know how many months into the project, we never touched it anymore because by that point it was all
It was
it had done its job kind of thing. And then the next year and a half, we didn't even go near it again.
nice. But I mean, I think that this fits with what you were saying at the beginning. You sometimes you do procedural generation because you're lazy. Not lazy, but of course, like because you have limited set of resources. I guess lazy.
Yeah.
It's more of a joke. But I think this also leads to I think a common misconception some people have about procedural generation, especially if they've never done it before. A lot of people, a lot of game designer might think, okay, I'm using ProcGen to generate a lot of level because it's easier. And I'm thinking, not really. In my perspective, using procedural generation is way harder because you have to be so good as a programmer that you can generate stuff procedural, which is not necessarily easy. There's a lot of math involved sometimes. But you also need to be such a good level designer that you can distill those rules in a way that, in a formal way that you can encode in a program, and that is not easy. So I feel that if you want to use those techniques to have an easier time, I don't think I don't think it's the right way to go.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I think you're right about having to. It's that thing about like incorporating other people in that process. So if you're generating, you've got to be able to do it as well at first, but you've also got to have some of the sensibility of level designer, and you've also got to have some of the sensibility of your 3D art. So in the project I'm working on at the minute, I'm working with a guy called Aaron Hicks, and he's doing all the prop work for it. The levels are all generated, but they're pulling in his artwork, and there's a kind of two-way process where some of the stuff he's doing informs how the levels are like put together by the algorithm, because he makes things that you're drawn towards as a player because they're focal points, or we're designing areas of rooms that we want the player to feel like there's a directionality to them, and so you have to have a kind of a back and forth between all the different processes to make sure that when the thing gets generated, it doesn't just do the job mathematically, it also does the job in terms of it feels like a place that's interesting visually, but it also fulfills those kind of game design rules that you're talking about, like the gameplay mechanics and so on. So yeah, I don't know. It's tricky, but I think that you can use really simple rules basically, and just spend time like tweaking those rules and just honing them. I think the mistake is to just plug something in and go, right, there we go, procedural done. And you can just tell when that's happened. It's the same with any craft, really. If someone was going to level design something by hand, they would spend a long time over every location. They'd revisit it, they'd rework it, they'd play test it. You just have to do the same thing.
So we have a sort of technical-ish question from Jonaid Eid Salah. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name the wrong way. I'm really bad with pronouncing names that are not Italian. And they say, I wonder if some tried to use the tensor field plus streamline generation algorithm, usually used for city roads, but taken to other kinds of map. I wonder how that would compare to Voronoi for islands, for example.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out through kind of the whole. There's a lot of new techniques basically coming through. There's a lot of people talking about using machine learning to contribute to this area, and I think everything's up for grabs. And like what I said earlier is that that particular approach might create a different sort of feeling. And I know I could talk about this. I'm getting a bit kind of arty about it, but I do believe that algorithms have a kind of feel to them when you use them in games, particularly. And so I think that certain algorithms work really well for certain things, and that approach might make a really specific type of like road network that works really well for a specific type of game. Because there are millions of types of road networks, so it makes sense that we should be using different types of algorithms to simulate those and to generate those. So I think it's definitely the case that like if you look at Townscape, Oscar,
Oscar Stahlberg, yeah.
Yeah, you look at his work, like he's a really good example of how an algorithm gives rise to a sort of aesthetic. So the fact he's just done a very simple thing where he's been like shuffling these kind of semi-hex grids around. Well, they're quads, aren't they? But they're shuffled around in a way to break the symmetry of them, and that gives you a very specific feeling. What he's doing inside that is actually quite traditional, the kind of bitwise. It's the same thing that people use in 2D sprite maps editors. He's just doing it in 3D, and he's really nicely kind of tailoring and honing all the different aspects of that algorithm to give rise to a really beautiful, very specific kind of unique feel. And so I think that that's something that procedural generation can really do. People just need to like hone it. They need to take advantage of what that particular algorithm is really good at, and then kind of lean into that, and sort of follow it through. So I think any technique's kind of worth trying out.
Jonai does reply, yeah, there's potential in teaching a neural network what kind of generation is good and what kind of generation is bad, and he filtered the best generations. I've seen something similar-ish, not sure if neural networks were involved, probably not. Mike Cook is an academic, is a researcher, is a lecturer, and he has been working on this bizarre program called Angelina, which probably stands for something, but I don't remember. And basically, Angelina is this AI, we can call it like that, that can make games. And there have been a lot of incarnations of Angelina, a lot of variants, including some that takes input that generates a game, and you say no, it's bad, no, it's good, and she learned from that kind of input as well. The stuff she can generate, it's fairly limited, so don't expect, and it's fairly similar. But I've not seen a lot of applications where you have interactive machine learning procedural generation content. Have you seen any? What is your...
But, yeah, I mean, it was actually a conference that Mike was part of, the organisers for. I think you might have been there actually, but I'm not sure you got there till it was like half over or something. I can't
Oh
remember.
yes, I remember. I arrived too late. Yeah.
There was a couple of presentations where people were using machine learning and neural net based stuff, and there's one I don't particularly remember which it was. It was basically fed a load of Mario levels, like the 2D Mario platformer levels, and then it was learning what made a Mario level, and then was rebuilding Mario levels, and it was fine and it worked, but I'm always go back to my idea of things feeling a particular way. There's not really a good way of like assessing whether something feels good or fun. It sort of goes, yes, this is 80% close to a traditional Mario level that we've had 1,000 copies of that have been run through the system, and here's another one. I'm like, okay, I mean that's great, and maybe that is useful. I mean, I'm sure it is useful, but I don't really like that approach because to me it seems a bit soulless. It doesn't seem to have much room for like personal like ownership of that system or creativity in that system. It's sort of number crunching, trying to do the same thing. And for me, like I'm like, well, fine, but shouldn't we be trying to do different things? So I'm happy if people use those systems and then they push them in a new direction. But I don't know really. It's difficult to say. I think that it's certainly not a magic bullet for creating beautiful or interesting content. Some people think they can get a procedural system or machine learning system and they can press the button and it will basically bypass the role of an artist or a level designer or a curator. It will just be like, bang, there you go, and they'll be like, oh, this is good. I think you still need people who have got an eye for how something should look or feel or play, and they need to be involved in those processes. Otherwise, they just you lose that kind of aspect of it. I don't think there's anything. I think procedural generation is fantastic, and I think it's a lot more human than people think. But I guess that's because I use it as a tool, and I'm very conscious of what I let it do and what I don't let it do, and how I kind of fudge it to make it do what I want, rather than me ending up making games because that's what the procedural generation puts out.
And also, I think that if you do something with a neural network, it might be even harder to debug. It's fairly easy. Well, I won't say easy, but it's fairly standard to debug a procedural generation piece of code that doesn't produce what you want. Usually it's clear what aspects of it are not working. If using a neural network, you basically trapping yourself literally into a black box. And it's like, okay, I guess, what if I just want to change this bit? Well, so I think that there's a lot of issues with procedural generation, with neural networks and machine learning that still we need to take into account. But I think they can be very interesting. Maybe to generate stuff like pieces of dialogue, maybe, or to generate decisions for players.
I think that my biggest, I really, actually, okay, I'm going to complain. I really don't like machine learning. I think it's massively problematic, and I think
It is
that
very problematic.
particularly academic community aren't facing up to this at all, and are just like merrily carrying on with it. From my point of view, I think the best thing I heard about it is like bias. It's a bias confirmation system. So it just takes stuff that people are biased about already, and it just enhances that. So you just end up, what comes out is what's gone in, but like even more like
Biased.
you know, biased. Yeah. So I think that's a problem that you can get in anything you apply it to. So if you're applying it to like a Mario game design, you're just going to get out like, you're going to get out that, and you're going to get out what whoever picked those levels that were decided to go in, and where did they come from? And it's just going to confirm what came out of that particular thing. It's not going to necessarily offer anything new. And obviously, it's very problematic in lots of other aspects as well. So I know there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, and I recently did a workshop using machine learning for real-time generative music, and there's some interesting stuff in there as well. But there's still quite a lot of. I think people are very taken with the novelty of it, and are not necessarily thinking about the implications of what it might involve.
So we have an interesting question from Nikita Elizarov. Again, I hope I pronounce it correctly. What about using classical procedural generation to generate a ton of environments and then using the neural network to evaluate them? So about that, I've seen a paper. Don't ask me where when I forgot. It's one of those things you find like on Reddit and then you forget about it. Where there's a big problem if you want to do self-driving cars, if you want to have neural networks learning to do image recognition on street videos, basically. One task that is super slow, that is basically the bottleneck of the system, is that there are people that are by hand are marking in a frame of a video which parts are cars, which parts are people, which parts are roads, and this takes forever. So what they did, they take a game like GTA, probably was GTA, and they just hacked it to generate the video and the segmented
Right.
video where the roads are red and the people are blue and the cars are green, and they fed it together, and that machine had so much material that it was able to kickstart the learning that they could then tune with real images. So it massively reduced the input they had to do for that. So it's definitely possible, probably, but I don't know. Have you seen something like that?
No, I mean, I know that people have done it, and you can use like neural networks to evaluate the output of procedure generation. It's just a sort of a slightly more advanced step of generating a map and then using a pathfinder to make sure that you can get through it, or you can reach all the particular points that you need to. It's a similar kind of process. It's just what your criteria are, and obviously pathfinding is just a single criteria pretty much, whereas a neural net can support a bunch of criteria. So I can see people doing that. I, again, would probably try and make sure that it worked before I generated it rather than evaluating it afterwards. But that's just my particular approach to doing things, I think if you're talking about a more realistic, application, then that makes sense to use evaluation techniques afterwards. From my point of view, when I'm making a game, I'm not making a realistic space. I'm making a space that has to function in a particular way. So I kind of fix it up front rather than trying to evaluate it afterwards. But I'm sure you get some, it'd be a useful tool, I'm pretty sure. I've seen some, on what you were saying, there's been some interesting stuff where people are now getting paid to model stuff for image recognition. So if there's like spiders that go off and like look through Instagram for photos of people standing next to a particular motorbike, a company will get paid to render thousands of shots of that particular motorbike from a 3D model in loads of different virtual environments that the machine learning algorithm neural net then just looks at for days, and now it can find the ones on Instagram. So yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But that's kind of what's happening.
And it's really, I don't know if it's like surprising, sad, I don't know which word to find, that a lot of machine learning that we think it's automated, it's actually done with the blood, mechanical turkey, people that are paid 1 cent per picture to click, and find the cat or find the dog or find the face. You have no idea. There are armies of people that are.
There was that joke. Yeah, there was that joke that every time you do a capture, on the internet, you're just building up a big machine learning library somewhere.
Well, I mean, part of that is actually true,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it's
it's true.
yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting, and but again, you see how in the past 20, 30, 40 years, you know, procedural generation has changed and has evolved, and how much we learn, and how many good applications are there, and how many bad applications are there. So I think that maybe it's just a matter of finding the good recipe. Maybe there are
Mm,
situations in which neural networks and GANs, who I know John I was mentioning again, they might be perfect. Maybe we just need to find it. Maybe we just need to find the good architecture that makes it amazing. I don't know. Maybe you can be the one doing it. If you have ideas, just try it. And maybe they don't work, but negative
mm.
results are results. If they
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
work and you manage to do something that absolutely doesn't work, talk about it, because
Mhm.
maybe someone else will look at your work and they will say, "Oh, it didn't work, but what if I try this one?" And that's how you build something that eventually work. Even neural networks that now are super popular, they stop working for some times because people didn't, there have been a couple of winters in AI because people weren't using the right approaches. And it's just a matter of going back, looking at them, and maybe finding what's good. And this is true both for procedural generation, from which now we
Mm.
have a much better grasp on what works and what doesn't, compared to neural networks. Maybe we need 5 years of neural networks before we learn it. I don't know. But again, if you have ideas, try it. Try to see what you can
Mm.
generate with that and post it online. I would be very happy to see what you can create. So if you have this chance, please do it. Maybe you can be the next the next Oscar Stahlberg. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? But we've been looking at the Signal From Tölva for quite some time. So I just wanted to maybe briefly talk about another game that you worked on. The light keeps us safe. Do you want to talk a bit about that as well?
Yeah, I mean that's the last game I made with Big Robot, and uh, I mean I'm proud of it, and I think we did a good job with it. But we had a much smaller budget than we had for the game before, and the I guess the kind of environment, the indie environment, had changed a lot from when we first started. Things were, when we released our first game, there was, you'd be lucky if there was one new game a day, or one new game in a week that came out on Steam. And by the time we got to this point, there was it's just so much more difficult to get noticed and to get kind of traction. We had a smaller budget, so although I like it, I think it's a good game. I'm proud of it. It was kind of the last game we made together as a team in that studio. And it took a lot of what we'd done before, partly because of just we didn't want to throw away the experience we got, and also again for the necessity of. I mean, I guess I should make it clear that all the time that we were working as Big Robot, there was only ever, I think, three, maybe four full-time members,
Wow.
and most of the time there was only two, maybe three. Um, so it's a very small team, and we were doing uh, quite ambitious projects. We were doing first-person shooter, full 3D games, set in open worlds, and we had to leverage what we could to be able to continue to do that and to make the things that we wanted to make. So Light Keeps Us Safe was kind of a cross between the two previous projects in a way, in that it was a real-time generated set of environments that you had to navigate in a similar style to Sir, but with some of the stuff we'd learned from Tolva. Um, and the kind of the game was a bit more of a stealth-based game. Basically, it was more of a kind of survival stealth-based game set in a much more kind of dark, post-apocalyptic, kind of weird stalker-esque sort of environment. And I don't think there was a few new techniques there, but as I sort of mentioned earlier, a lot of the techniques in procedural generation tend to come around, and you're just effectively adding to the knowledge, you're adding to them. So the demo scene stuff in the 90s may well have used voxels, but you could only have a certain amount of density of that on the screen because it just wasn't possible to do it any quicker. So that meant that you could only resolve crude objects. Whereas as we are now, you can do things with much more fine detail. So even from Sir to Tolva, there was stuff that I could do this time that I couldn't do in Sir, just because processing power had increased and just because we could, do a lot more on the GPU than we could before. So I did a bit more. I did quite a lot of pathfinding in Tolva to try and get more accurate kind of flow through the world. Not with Tolva, sorry, with the light. But it took broadly the same kind of techniques and applied them with like a higher kind of quality, basically higher fidelity of graphics and so on.
So I know that you are working on something new as well right now. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I've been lucky enough to well, we were kind of working on various ideas over the last summer and taking them to different people because at the point of finishing Light, we knew we wouldn't be able to self-fund anymore. So we were looking for publishers and working up different ideas. And so I had this idea of basically making again, as a reaction to the games we've been making, which were quite slow-paced and quite kind of like atmospheric. I wanted to make something that was just really punchy, fast, kind of almost arcadey, like an old school kind of shooter game. So I thought about the idea of basically doing a generated FPS dungeon crawler, which was, I knew I could do it, and I was interested in doing it because I felt that it would be an opportunity to make it a bit tighter, put more arcade features in, so that instead of just generating a world and having a lot of objects in it that are just aesthetic, just like the trees and the environment, it's like have objects that you can interact with, have like spawns, have treasure chests, have traps, have things that kind of trap that sets up another trap that causes something to do. I wanted to be able to do a kind of a bit more Spelunky-like approach to generating a smaller space. And there are a lot of games, there are quite a few FPSs that do this sort of thing. But what I thought was really interesting would be to be able to put the parameters into the player's hands. And when we made Sir, one of the things I did is I put in like a kind of cheat page where you could actually dictate the generation parameters.
Nice.
So you could just like max out the number of tree-based cells, or you could max out the number of, I don't know, like pools in the environment. And I didn't want it to do it like that because that's like a non-diegetic way. So in the new game, which is called Into the Pit, you basically like create the level as if you were an alchemist. So you have various ingredients that you mix together to generate the level, and depending on what ingredients you put in, that affects the way the level is built. So we're still working through this, but for instance, at the minute, you could generate a level that is kind of looks quite a lot like a stone fort. It's full of lots of like fortress type stuff and ramparts and stonework. But then you can also generate a level that's much more like a fungus kind of hollow. But then you can generate them both together. And what the algorithm does is it basically builds them and it mixes the environments together. And it doesn't just do it room by room, it actually breaks the rooms up. So you halfway through a room, it might transition into a different environment and then go back. So that's the kind of where I'm taking the PCG stuff in this game, is that kind of level of parameter kind of control.
That sounds really interesting, actually. And I don't think I've seen many games doing that. I'm trying to think. Probably haven't seen any games
No, I
doing
mean,
something like that.
it inevitably will be less than I would want it to be because of the constraints of the gameplay itself. So there's certain things I had in earlier on where you could kind of change the verticality of the levels significantly with the ingredients, but it just broke so many things in terms of the gameplay. It's not in there right now. I might reintroduce it, but it's not that likely. But there are other things, so you can mix things that affect the gameplay. So when you create the dungeon, you can also edit the difficulty of it by putting a different object in. You can change the distribution of the different enemy types by putting other objects in. You can, when you kill an enemy, it drops loot or it drops health. You can affect the percentage of it dropping health or loot by putting another object in. So you can kind of choose to run a dungeon where you're going to get more health but less loot, or vice versa. Uh, and then even the actual powers, the magical powers that you like, the powers that you use to combat the enemies, that's also like a modular procedural system. So you kind of acquire them and stack them on each other. So you can add like a poison effect to your attack, then you can add another effect on top of that, and you can split that effect. So those are all part of that kind of system.
So of course, I haven't seen the game. I only seen the images you sent me because I don't think there's any video around it yet.
No, not yet.
So it's quite nice to have a sort of preview of the game. But I'm trying to think. I don't know if you can talk about that. Maybe it's spoilers. But how are you justifying this within the game? So I'm imagining that maybe with the potion you open a portal to a different realm.
Yeah, that's it.
Is it the it?
Yeah, and it's basically it's a ritualistic kind of. There's a ritual chamber, and within the chamber there's multiple altars, and each altar takes a certain class of item. So there's altars that take items that affect difficulty. There's altars that take items that affect like the visual form, if you see what I mean. And there's an altar that takes an item that affects like other modifiers. So you enter the chamber and you have gathered these ingredients. You place them on the altars, and then you go into the pit, and you enter the level. And within the level, obviously, you find other ingredients because it's like a looter shooter, and you take those ingredients back to the ritual chamber, and you can then combine them in a different way to get to a different place to fight different creatures with different skills.
Nice. That sounds really nice. Again, I'm really bad at those kind of games. I might give it a go, but I can't promise.
It's much faster than any of the FPS games I made before. It's very twitchy, fast paced, like quite arcadey. So it's probably going to be even worse for you.
Is there going to be like an assist mode where I can remove the enemies and just?
I don't know. Like we've actually had tourist modes in a lot of our games.
Please.
For that purpose. But I don't know. I mean, maybe. I mean, there's a possibility I could give you an object that you could mix into it that just, I don't know, made all the creatures friendly. But
I think I would love, one way which I can pet the creatures. Like, can you pet the monsters you need to the pit?
They're not very pettable. They're pretty mean.
Give me a hand. Give me a creature. I'm sure. We've seen like blood splattered everywhere, but I'm sure we can find a way to pet it. So we've been chatting for a bit longer than 1 hour and a half, and I'm absolutely melting. So there's a question that I'm asking to all the people that have been on the show, and the question is, how many versions of Unity do you have installed on your machine?
Right now, I've only got. You know what? I've only got one.
I don't believe you.
Yeah, I used to have about like 10, but since I committed to this project, and for various reasons we're fixed to a particular like version of Unity, I actually went through all my other projects, well, almost all of them, deliberately upgraded them to this version. I'm on 2018 LTS. I upgraded everything I'd got. I spent like a whole day just upgrading all my projects to this, and then I deleted all the other versions of Unity.
I imagine the joy of freeing like 50 gigabytes.
Yeah, it was really cathartic. It's right. Bye.
I can't do that. I never know if I need a version. And trust me, I've deleted many times, almost all of them, and I always regretted it. So...
Yeah, it took me a whole day to go through everything that I had felt like I needed to keep and upgrade it. And then I just delete them all.
We'll see. I don't feel I'm at that stage yet. So, Tom, if people want to find you, where they can find you?
They can find me on Twitter. So I'm at Tom Nullpointer. That's probably the best place. Or nullpointer.co.uk is my website for people who still look at websites. And I think that's probably the best places to get hold of me. I probably will start an account for either the game or the kind of relative like company holding stuff at some point, and I'll probably start up a Discord as well when we're a little bit further along with it.
But I've put a link to your stuff down below, so if people want to have a look at that, wait for the live to be over. But you can find some info to find Tom in a box below. Now, if for the people that are still watching, stick around for a bit because I'm going to show you just a few frames of something I'm working on. But with that being said, Tom, thank you so much for being here tonight, despite the 38 degrees.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great talking to you.
You have no idea how sweaty I am.
Thanks for watching, everybody.
Thank you so much for your time, Tom. It was really nice. Chat to you later, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, bye.
Now, for the folks that are still here, first of all, thank you so much. I imagine that most of you, I imagine, are from the UK, so probably you're melting as well. Now, as you know, as I've been teasing for some time, I'm working on a new video. I love making those kind of interviews, but I would love to do more longer video, more proper video essays, as people are calling them. I prefer calling them like short documentaries. I think it makes them a bit more serious, I guess. And also with all the time I'm spending on them, please let me call them documentaries and not essays. So I've done one on the Eye of Creatures, a game that was really influential for me personally, it was really important for me. And I'm making another one on a game that as well was very influential. And the game was Conway's Game of Life. If you don't know it, it's a very weird game. Some people will struggle to even call it a game. But essentially what it is, it's a grid, and you basically decide which cells are black and white on this grid, and then you let it go. And it evolves. And what's interesting is that it evolves in a very deterministic way, but the results can be really unpredictable, really chaotic. And it's quite interesting. I would say undecidable, if you know what that means. And there are people that are using life to build computers. And this is what the video is going to be about. It's probably going to be called Let's Build a Computer in Life. It is slightly clickbaity in a sense that I'm not going through the entire process of building a computer in life, but I'm going to go through all the steps necessary and to show you all the components needed to do that, and then showing you people that have done that. And it's going to be a journey as well on the history of the game. So I hope you are going to enjoy it. Hopefully, it's going to take so much. I probably wanna be overboard with Premiere Pro, and trust me, doing video editing when there are 35 degrees in my room, it's not a good idea. So it probably would have came out sooner if it wasn't for the heat wave. Now, with that being said, I want to thank all the people that are still watching. I seen Nikita, John Knight, Backshake, Solomon, Aaron, Joe Summer. Hi, Joe. All the people that have been all the people that have been commenting and leaving questions. Thank you so much for interactive, despite the fact that I'm literally melting. And if you don't know yet, or if this is the first time you're watching, the show is made possible thanks to the contribution of all these awesome people on Patreon. On top of doing YouTube videos, which I've started a few months ago, so it's fairly a new endeavor. It's too hot, I can't talk anymore. It's fairly a new endeavor. I've been producing educational content on my website, on my blog, for about 5 years. And I post tutorials, mostly about shaders, sometimes about AI, hopefully about procedural generation as well. It's something I've been planning on covering for quite some time. But you can find all sort of tutorials. And, if you just go on... I can never find it the right point. If you just go on Patreon or on my blog, you can find about 200 of those tutorials. If there is something that you're interested, you're more than free to join. Most of the content is available for free on my blog, but if you want to download the entire Unity package with a lot of extra content and tools, usually that is available through Patreon only. But if you think that you can do it on your own, then the blog should be more than enough. So hopefully you have both chances. But if you want to support the show, if you want to support me being able to create more content and tutorials like the ones I have on my website, you're more than welcome to do that. So with that being said, thank you so much to all the people that are supporting the show, to all the people that have been watching the show today or tonight, depending on where you are. And before I completely melt, let me say goodbye, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.